I would like to invite our next speaker. Don't go away, we're still here. Audrey Leblanc. Oh yeah, I can see her. Who is a PhD historian specialized in the history of photography, graduated at the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Science in Paris, and then worked as a state researcher there. She is currently commissioned researcher at the Photographies collaborative project in Switzerland. She has curated 2 exhibitions dedicated to press photography and edited their catalogs, including Icons of May 68, Images Have a History at the National Library of France in 2018. She was awarded 4 times a research postdoctoral fellowship, and she teaches history and visual arts and analyzes the cultural history of image producers and the visual culture from the 1960s to the 1980s.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for all the team of the Fast Forward. I'm really, really happy to be here and to share my work with you. So, as Sabina said this morning, photography can't just be to press a button. So I won't speak about neither photography or photographers, but about women who took care of photo in press agencies. Photographic press agencies are much studied from a news perspective, a specificity by which they claim the historical role of their images, and on which the history of photojournalism is built for the most part, mainly from the second half of the 20th century. Black Star is one of the flagship in this prestigious history, especially known for civil rights cover in USA. But this prestigious narrative, it's a kind of synthesis of the agency's history, comes up against an archive in which famous images of Black Star are poorly represented. An archive which original indexing, kept in the Image Center of Toronto, is organized by subject, location, and author. Appropriate and efficient in the commercial environment of a press agency, this organization rarely responds to researchers' expectations. My first methodological choice faces this heterogeneous set of black and white prints by getting back to the materiality of the collection and considering it as an object to be apprehended as a whole. It is then difficult to understand alone the meaning of the classifications and marks of which it is important, moreover, to distinguish the various temporal strata to read their functions. However, these elements of organization of the collection, indexes, keywords, inventories, outcome of the work of lesser-known professions in the history of photojournalism. They leave few traces in the narrative or in the archive, apart from the results of the professional actions. Therefore, in order to better understand the collection as it is accessible today, my second methodological choice became to study these jobs with diverse names: librarians, researchers, picture editor, and later, because of the displacement of the Black Star collection from a corporate press agency to a public cultural institutions, archivist and documentalist. A genealogy of women then appears. The first one managed the Black Star picture library of the agency, composed of prints for black and white and slides for color. They were substituted by other women when the black and white part of this library was transferred to the Image Center in Toronto, becoming the Black Star collection. These women have been invisibilized, rarely mentioned in narrative of the agency's history, or evocated through the only prism of seduction. This métiers de femmes, like said Michel Perrault, women's job, are indeed considered ancillary to other activities that are presented as central to the funds. However, their interviews and their reports document the history of the whole, each being the heir to the previous ones. The black and white print Black Star collection threw a part as a tool for the exploitation of visual production by the Black Star Agency between 1935 to 1990. Its photo library. Set up at the early days, the photo library recovered the photographs produced with the commercial partners. Its classification was organized more systematically during the 70s and the 80s. In 1997, it fell into disuse with the start of digitalization of the items that the agency continued to exploit and sell. From this point of view, evaluated in the name of its historical importance for the visual history of the 20th century, this part of the library, which for the black and white circulated at the time in the form of prints, became, at the time of its institutional acquisition, an incomplete, useless, outdated object, expensive and cumbersome for the agency to preserve. Black Star disposes of it in a general context of sale of these photo libraries by the media companies and of restructuring of the press image market in the early 2000s. The despite testimonies of the women who managed the photo library and then the collection, highlight a daily history of this photography market. This oral and feminine history reveals a gender distribution of tasks ignored by the history of photojournalism, hierarchical and largely constructed by men on the photographers and agency managers of the period, who were also men. However, the strategies adopted by the company to multiply markets, to make the whole production profitable, and to limit the losses testify to an empirical relationship to the photograph, whose interpretation of the visual content and the dissemination of these markets of the illustration depend entirely on the work of this women's team. So I'd like to do it with this plan, and I begin with the genealogy of unknown women. Emma Gurry is part of the staff of the agency in its early days as head of the picture library. Yukiko Lonwa, wife of photographer John Lonwa, being working as a researcher at the library in '64 when Howard Chapnick became president of the agency. She gradually increases her working time, participates in a more systematic structuring of the classification of images, become editors, and then, shortly after the departure of Emma Gurry, takes over the responsibility of the photo library in '73 until the end of the '80s, early '90s. You can see her in the middle of the library and the team. Managed by women at Black Star, the library is taken in hand by other women at the time of its institutional patrimonialization. These women become the custodians of the memory of the past uses and functioning of the library. In 2003, Penelope Dixon and Associated is commissioned by Canadian Cultural Property Export Review Board to appraise Black Star's collection of black and white prints with the Center of Images in Toronto becoming responsible for the care of the collection. She advocates maintaining the collection as a whole in order to add cultural and therefore economic value to the transaction. The collection is officially donated to the Image Center in 2005. Here, Valerie Matteau becomes responsible for it until 2012 and maintains the links with Benjamin Chapnick, the president of Black Star Agency. She participated in the installation of the collection in the final building of the Image Center in 2012 and their opening after renovation work. In this transfer, and thanks to the expertise of these professional women, the order of the drawers is respected. Original craft envelopes and folders revised one by one, are kept in their initial classification with their keywords written in marker as soon as they contain the slightest document, meaning tier sheets, order forms, typed word, typed stories, detached caption, etc. They form the Black Star ephemera collection at the center of images, whose materiality allows researchers not only to look at a glance at what it is in the drawer, but also how to overhaul the archive was arranged by Black Star. Especially since, according to Yukiko Leonoi, I quote, "Black and white system didn't evolve too much from the beginning. I guess it stayed in a primitive state." End of the quote. So what is a library and why is it important for our visual culture? The well-known narrative of the history of photojournalism, in which Black and Star frames fit, suggests that the library would be the archive of its production, in particular of that valued in the story, the news. But the library doesn't have a conservation function. It is another instrument of exploitation of the images produced on a segment, whatever they are, which is recovers to sell them in otherwise and other markets. In the flow, indeed, photographs fall into the library available for all uses and no longer only those related to their newsworthiness for a specific moment. As Benjamin Shapnick explains, the library is autonomous and has its own activity. I quote, "There were two aspects to the business. One was a segment, and one was existing material. Our library was almost always developed from materials that was left over from a segment. Nobody in those days shot for library sales." The two sales channels for the photograph produced do not overlap or reflect each other. Each operates according... Sorry, I'm lost. Each operates according to its own logic. The segment is an economic agreement between companies with sharing of the expenses at the time of the production of the images. At Black Star, they always try to do it as an segment. The press editorial staff, a priori the most frequent partner, bears the cost of developing the films in exchange for the scoop of the images. It does its own editing and most often keeps its own prints. The rest is sent to Black Star, which edits this leftover to offer them to other distribution channels, such as foreign sales, library files. The library is intended to respond to iconographic requests. They came in the form of letters for publishing companies mostly, but also from press companies. The on-approval mark on the back of some of the prints in the collection means, for example, that the prints were considered by the editor of Life magazine for reproduction. The proportion of published photographs from the Black Star collection found in Look and Life indicates that this type of sales, meaning illustrations and series, were massively irrigating this publication. The iconographic exploitation is an important daily activity that requires the agency to adapt its theme and premises to respond to it. The agency can't be satisfied only with good shots. The librarians at the interface of the daily sales, multiple and regular over time, also make it lives. Presented as secondary for its business, at no point, I quote, was the library worth more than 25% of our annual income. The agency couldn't, however, make the economy of this activity and the various markets in which it makes profitable of expensive production are strategically sought out together. The library recycles images produced once the segment time has passed, and the segments concern all images production, even the editorial one. The Black Star ephemera collection contains, in fact, the same type of accompanying document list of caption, for example, for photograph of birth of a dolphin, atomic blast explosion, roller disco, and so on. Reminder of report sold in news, remand of report produced for the internal report of company, which the agency has made a specialty incorporate, portrait of celebrities, return of shipment abroad, etc. Contrary to its apparent homogeneity, the library brings together very diverse prints in their production dates, their initial functions, their circulation, their statute, and their generations. Upon untiring this operating tool, all are relieved in their segment production description in favor of a new description in accordance with the needs of the library activities. Subjective to the same system of keywords established according to their content iconographic, the library permanently assigns all photography to its illustrative dimension. A photographer like Charles Moore sees his images classified for a quarter-under to the generic word civil rights, when the other becomes women, telephone, motoring, school, Indians, etc. However, this classification is the result of action and human decision of women who, on the one hand, receive the different prints for the files and, on the other hand, respond to the iconographic requests for which these prints, the library, were intended. I quote Yukiko, "I mean big list of requests used to come from textbook, and one researcher was assigned to file their request. So, for instance, they would say they want to illustrate infinity, some images which signify infinity." End of the quote. The librarian team chooses the prints that could correspond to this request, sends them to the client who makes his choices, and then returns them. They are reintegrated into the library, possibly as is under the term infinity. The collection is divided in four series: countries and places, World War II, personalities and subject. Of the four large sections that compose it, countries and places and personalities occupy 3 times more space than the other two and largely dominated the whole. They testify of the important proportion of banal images produced and diffused, as well as the mass of potential requests to which they correspond. All are sub-organized by thematic keywords. At the time of imagery, there is no indexing system. Everything was in Emma's and Howard's head. Yukiko Lonoa initiates a cataloging of her husband's photographs. Then imagery generalizes this principle and builds a catalog card which allows, in addition to classifying them, to track down each image of the photo library to monitor its commercialization. But it has been lost. The result potential of the image gates the structure of the photo library and the interpretation of the images. In order to meet the widest range of requests, the thematic keyword chosen by the librarians remain as general as possible and depend on the interpretation of the images. Only few of them, as Yukiko Lonoa, edited for files, but all the pictures librarians are those who created the folder category and choose the keywords. If a picture came in and that category did not exist, they create a new file and label it. The researchers could take initiative, but the librarian would know when that happened without monitoring, neither documented how the subject heading changed. There was no ledger or list. It was, I quote, very physical going through, end of the quote. The organization of the library is done organically as requests come in, without any real plan, in an empirical classification of the prints. The date is not necessarily associated with the visual content. It is only useful for the agency's photo library if it facilitates the availability of the image. Otherwise, it gets lost. Librarians filter the production and, in the description of the images, reduced to their visual content, generate the added value that allows them to be sold. They select them to propose their dissemination and keep the memory of them. In the slide is a quote of a photographer. and a sailor, saying the memory of the agency is in the head of the librarians. Whether at the time of the classification of the photograph or at the time of its selection to be proposed in response to a request, it is the library staff who interprets the content of the image put into circulation on the illustrated market, anticipated in a long term. Illustrated market means magazine, press, books, and also television. Dependent of the expertise of this woman, still largely ignored by the history of photojournalism, our visual culture has been established, at least as much as by photojournalists, by these shadowy professional figures whose names and importance should be made known. So I propose to complete this narrative with this one, Women at Desk, and in collaborative work like this historian of photography is beginning to do, like Nadia Burr and Gail Morel. And as a conclusion, I would focus on the idea that maybe the preservation of the past of the media is also a question of gender. The iconographic request for which the agencies set up a photo library correspond to a daily office activity and a spectacular, described as secondary in their economic life by the professional who hardly mention them. Transmitted by an ephemeral oral history, more difficult to make known and minimized, it has been neglected by historians of photojournalism who have preferred spectacular, punctual events and heroized male figures. However, it is the image exploitation tool linked to this activity that stand out here as a central archive of history of photojournalism. Howard Becker demonstrated it in Art Words. This small trade, affiliated to technical service in branch, should not be considered as secondary. Librarian tells the daily sales of the image funds, manage customer requests, and explains the filing choice for an efficient global exploitation of these funds, when they are not at the initiative very often of the good conservation as the fund of media images for historical purposes. As a true memory of still images collections, they ensure, regardless of their cultural devaluation, the durability of photojournalism images on the illustrated market over time. So, actively contributed to the structuring of the visible, the archive renews the history of photojournalism, including in its gender level. Thank you.